I'm sure you are not a stranger to logging onto YouTube and seeing the many videos under the language learning niche where different learners are showing their specifically speaking abilities. And after a decade and being able to reach the point of being confident to learn my 11th language starting this year, I want to really show the transparent reality of what it's like. Because there are so many things that I would have told my 20-year-old self about a decade ago that I wish she had known before embarking on wanting to become a polyglot and looking up to a lot of the creators that are bigger in the language learning niche, especially on YouTube. The very first thing is I automatically thought that I would never drop down a level, right? Because we know the work that goes into learning every single language or even learning a language more deeply, right? There's so much logistical work as well as a lot of mental barriers that we have to really master and get to know ourselves more. I think it would have broken my younger self's heart to know that, yes, no matter if you get a C1 certificate in like 6 or 7 languages, like I once dreamed before, it doesn't mean that you will never drop down a level. Before, I used to think that that used to be really discouraging. So I kind of wanted to live in this fantasy that fluency would just never go away. Like I could just put it on a shelf and set it and forget it, even though that is definitely not how learning a language works. Because ultimately, right, it's a tool, it is a muscle to be strengthened, and it can recede and get a little bit weaker. Instead of thinking about what you perceive to have lost, aka all of the work that you put in, none of that means anything because I drop down a level or two, right, from not having and spending time with the language anymore. I would really emphasize that it is always an opportunity to begin to trust yourself and say to yourself, actually, I'm going to prove to myself that I can get back to the level that I desire, that fits my needs and my circumstances for right now, at my own rhythm, at my own pace. And the fact is, even though we might drop down a level, if we have established a good base around a B1, B2 in a language, we never really forget the language. There's a level of letting ourselves experience things in our language learning. Even though I worked super, super hard to pass my B2 exam and get into the C1 class for Turkish this year, I know that my level of Turkish now, after about 6 months of not really touching it, not really listening to anything in Turkish, I know it has gone down probably back to between a B1 and a B2 instead of where I used to be back in the summer. And I'm giving myself the permission to experience how that feels, right? My honest thoughts about that, but then being able to say, okay, Emily, whenever you want to though, allow yourself to experience what it's like to come back to that language. How can you allow your languages to adjust to yourself, to your life, right? And what I mean by that more of is, I didn't really need Turkish in my life. My life didn't need Turkish, so why would I need to constantly put pressure on myself to study it massively, even though I was already exhausted from these last 6 months, right? That's why I didn't touch it anyways. But that would have really demotivated me in the language process, even though I would have maintained my level, and it just wouldn't have been worth it emotionally and energy-wise for me to do so. But now that I have a little bit more free time, I know that I can now use Turkish to fit to my life, aka my life circumstance right now where I do have more time and it can fit in as a more joyous part of my day instead of feeling like I'm operating from a place of scarcity. If it takes me, another 6 months to build back up to where I was after I, graduated from my B2 class in Turkey, then so be it, because I want my life to be joyous and I want languages to be a joyous part of that. And so why would I force myself into a box that is going to really raise the stakes a lot higher and make me perceive the stakes as a lot higher if I don't study than they actually really need to be? It's definitely an opportunity to get to know yourself even better as a language learner. Now, if you are currently resonating with anything I said in this video before, then I want to invite you to my free community, the Mindful Multilingual Movement. It is free for now, and it's meant to help you as a solo language learner with ambitious goals be able to get support with other like-minded learners. Do go into the link below so you can join our private server on Discord. We'd love to have you. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about kind of goes into what I was talking about with my first point, which is if you have not run into a language yet that has truly challenged you, whether that be emotionally, logistically, mentally, then you definitely will. It's guaranteed, right? As you have more experiences, the probability of running into an obstacle that is going to totally throw you off balance gets even higher the more languages that you learn. If I had stopped my language journey at German or Italian, which I both learned those pretty fast in comparison to how I've learned some of my other very different languages from English, it gave my ego a really big boost to think about, hey, I learned this and this language, in however many months or something like that, because that is what I used to see all the time online, being a language learner pretty early and even like mid-decade into my journey. However, I will say that once I got into learning Arabic, those were probably, I think, my 5th and my 6th languages. If I had never continued on my journey, then I would have just never known the immense obstacles, what those felt like for me, and how I would need to navigate and handle them in my language learning to be able to continue learning languages just on my terms and more joyfully and more sustainably. It's very different for every language learner, right? Maybe you have a certain obstacle that you face with your very first language that you learn solo. Maybe it happens in your 6th or 7th language because you've breezed past through, all the first 5 languages that you have learned. Again, I would have seen this as my younger self as a huge roadblock. Like, I am not looking forward to having these huge mental barriers with Turkish and Arabic, thinking that I was learning too slowly and beating myself up about it, and doing so for like 3 or 4 years. I'm not even kidding. Like, it seriously damaged a lot of my joy. And I would have told myself what a really wonderful subscriber of mine on this channel actually commented down below in one of my previous videos, which is, you think you want to master a language, but what you actually want to do is master yourself. Because we forget that we're not learning just a language. We're not learning just a tool to connect. We have a lot of personal motivations to learn a language, even outside of that really have to do with our inner world. And whatever barriers or obstacles, especially mentally and emotionally, that we can bring into learning a language, that is inevitable. And again, the more languages we learn, the higher the possibility is that those obstacles are going to get in our way at some point. And even though short term, it did not feel great to experience those barriers, in the long term, it was so necessary for me to really understand and break down, why, Emily, do you feel like you are learning Arabic and Turkish too slowly? What does too slowly mean for you? What did that mean when you were learning fast? Did that take away your value as a language learner? Do you feel like you're a fraud now that you are having problems logistically with the grammar and the writing of Arabic that you didn't have in German? Giving ourselves, again, the opportunity to investigate more of our inner world and how we are thinking about our language learning process, right, is so integral to understanding how we can master ourselves while we are learning a language. And as I said before, you just gather a lot more data about how different language levels, different amounts of fluency that you may have across languages kind of comes and goes and fluctuates depending on your current life circumstances, life in general, that just get in your way sometimes. And even as things are always in flux around us, it is even more critical for us to understand, how can I adapt my languages to myself, to my life, instead of bending over backwards, worrying about, why can't I learn faster? By the way, I absolutely love hosting deep dive workshops on more of the mental and emotional barriers that we can really face in language learning that I don't see talked about a lot online. So again, go to the comments below, even after you join the Mindful Multilingual movement. Sign up for the waitlist to know when doors are open for my series of workshops for the coming year. The next thing I'm going to talk about is, you will notice that as you learn more languages, you start to mix up languages that don't even really have to do with each other, right? They're not technically from the same family, but your brain will mix them up anyways. And I think this was also bred from the myth that we, in our brains, right, that we have a space for French and that we have another space in our brains for Portuguese, and then there's a, space for German. That is actually not true. Everything that we know about language goes into one place in our brains. And that makes it just more easy to, at first, mix up our languages, even though they aren't from the same language family. And with very similar languages, you might find yourself mixing those up even more. But there was a time when I was like, why am I mixing up Turkish with German? Like, there are no links. But the fact is, the more languages that we either learn more deeply or we dabble in, the more that we get to strengthen our cognitive ability to recognize patterns, intuit how a language works. Before, I used to see, learning multiple languages and mixing them up as something to fear, something really embarrassing, something that would totally be like seen as a huge thing to make fun of. When in reality, what you are doing is you're allowing your brain time to understand, okay, like, let me sort this all out in this whole big stockpile of one place where I store all of your language knowledge. And over time, let's strengthen those neural connections. Now, perhaps the next thing will surprise you just as much as it did me. But the fact is, I realized that you eventually learn better how to make your goals authentic to you. I used to be a language learner that was totally obsessed with going as deep as possible into one language only, trying to get to a C1 or a C2 before finally giving myself permission to move on to the next language. And I had a huge fear of missing out. I wanted to comb through all of my textbook, all of the programs, even if programs repeated themselves with the same material they were trying to teach me how to learn, I would go through all of those, right? As both a perfectionist and as an introvert that just really liked reading and being in textbooks, okay? So I totally understand the fear of missing out and feeling like we have to get absolutely everything, all the information that we ever could about a language and be able to produce the language and have all 4 skills at the same level. And after you start realizing that it's not really possible for you to maintain all like C1 skills in Spanish as you go on to learning Turkish and German and Italian, right? Then you start to naturally learn how to prioritize better what you want to accomplish in each language. So maybe in Turkish, right, you want to prioritize more speaking instead of reading, right? Or maybe in German, you want to prioritize getting better at listening than any of the other skills you could be working on, right? Because we just have limited time and energy. And with even more languages comes even more opportunities to make wise choices about where we spend our energy. I think learning multiple languages has really helped me with prioritizing those really specific, more authentic goals to myself and what I actually want to get out of language learning. Share as well, what is your actual reality? What is your story with learning multiple languages if you are? And I'll see you next time in my next video.